and they've started putting gold leaf on the concrete. And you've got this lovely metaphor of this absolutely utilitarian concrete municipal hut gradually being covered by gold leaf. There's not a lot of gold leaf on it, but you can see the start of it. Anyway, that was the site of the Buddha giving the Satthipathana Sutta. And it's a bit like the Anapanasati Sutta, that it's a teaching the Buddha initiated. He called the monks around, said there was a teaching that he wanted to give, and gave this quite long discourse of the Satthipathana Sutta. There are different recensions of the Satthipathana Sutta. The main one that we use is from the Majjhima Nikaya of the Pali Canon, but you also get it in the Digha Nikaya, a slightly longer version, mainly of different kinds of charnel ground as the addition in the Digha Nikaya version. But you find it in a couple of different recensions in the Chinese tradition, translating from the Sanskrit traditions. So there are different versions of the texts. They've got different, some different emphases, but they share an obvious kind of core teaching. And it's mainly the core teachings, the teachings that are shared between the texts, that we'll look at over the next week. So it starts off, the Buddha says, this is the direct path for the purification of beings, for the surmounting of sorrow and lamentation, for the disappearance of dukkha and discontent, for acquiring the true method for the realization of nibbana, namely the four Satthipatthanas. So again, you've got the Satthipatthanas being set in this context of looking at the realization of nirvana, so that the text is explicitly addressing itself to that question. And then it goes on, what are the four? And you get this little refrain. Again, this is a kind of summary of the text. But in regard to the body, a monk abides contemplating the body, diligent, clearly knowing, mindful, free from desires and discontent in regard to the world. And then the same with feelings, the same with the mind, and the same with dhammas, that we abide diligent, clearly knowing, mindful, and free from desires and discontent in regard to the world. So that's the sort of setup, that's the introduction to the sutta. And the later stages of the sutta go into each of these four main headings in more depth. So it goes into how you become mindful of the body, how you become mindful of feelings, how you become mindful of the mind, how you become mindful of dhammas. So this just lays out that set of headings. I'm going to give you a little bit of Pali, if you don't mind. So the thing that gets translated as the direct path, in Pali it's ekayano. So the word's ekayano. And eka is just the word for one. And yano, same word that you find in Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, it just means way or path. So you've got this word that seems to mean one path or one way. And there's quite a lot of speculation about what that might mean, sort of how that can be interpreted. There are different readings of it. But if you don't mind, just to give you one reading, Sangharakshita's reading of this, or his comment on this in Living with Awareness, is he says you can't say that any particular formulation of the path can work for every person under every circumstance. But there are some formulations of the path that are so kind of comprehensive that they, in themselves, they contain all of the aspects of the path. I came across this lovely term, if I can find it, a sort of later Mahayana term describes some texts, some teachings, as I think it's Vaipulya. And Vaipulya literally means vast. But in this context, it means a teaching that contains the whole path. And a number of Mahayana sutras presented themselves as Vaipulya teachings, as teachings that summarize the whole path. And the thing is that these different texts came from different angles. Like the White Lotus Sutra, for example, from a very kind of mythic, symbolic language, would regard itself as a summary of the whole path. And I think what you can say with this is that it's an approach to the whole path that puts at the center of the mandala. It looks at it from the perspective of mindfulness. But from that perspective, it's looking at a range of experiences, a range of practices that together add up to something that lets us engage with the path, deepen our experience right up to the realization of nirvana. So it's one particular presentation of the principles of the path, in a way that other presentations would also be presentations of the principles of the path, but perhaps from a different starting point, a different flavor. Let me just find my place in my own notes if I can. This is a little paragraph I was quite intrigued by. This comes again from Living with Awareness. But Sangharakshita says of this text that it harmonizes and unifies every aspect of Buddhist practice into a concentrated, responsive awareness of body, feelings, mind, and mental objects. So if you don't mind, let me give you that again. It harmonizes and unifies every aspect of Buddhist practice into a concentrated, responsive awareness of body, feelings, mind, and mental objects. And I don't even know if I quite understand that, but it's almost like it's taking all of the various practices and it's saying what they add up to is this quality of awareness, this quality of mind that's a concentrated, responsive awareness of body, feelings, mind, and mental objects, just an alive, responsive, total interaction, total availability to that whole spectrum of experience. And I have to say, for me, that is a very evocative way of understanding what Dharma practice is trying to get us to. All of those practices adding up to that quality of aliveness and responsiveness to the whole field of experience. So that maybe is a kind of one-liner about in what way this represents a direct path from the perspective of mindfulness. So all of that comes out of just this idea of a direct path, ekayano. Next bit is pretty straightforward, I think, that it lets us overcome grief and lamentation, the extinction of pain and sorrow. We're not being very interactive yet, but if you don't mind, just make one more point. In the commentary on this, Sangharakshita says, his comment is, Buddhism is profoundly optimistic. I was in a study group the other day, and somebody quoting the Four Noble Truths in the group, and they were being very stoic about it, and they were saying what a kind of sobering message it was, that everything was suffering, that they wanted to be realistic and sort of address that. But Bante's take on this is that that's a serious misreading of what the Four Noble Truths is trying to say. That the basic Buddhist teaching is that everything arises in dependence on conditions. And the context of the Four Noble Truths is that suffering, like everything else, arises in dependence on conditions. And when those conditions cease, the event ceases. So when the conditions that give rise to suffering cease, suffering ceases. So the context of the Satthipathana Sutta is you're looking at a direct path for the overcoming of grief and lamentation and the extinction of pain and sorrow. And the rest of the sutta is a description of what those conditions are. What are the conditions that lead to the extinction of pain and sorrow and the direct realization of nirvana? And then the next step is it goes on to the four Satthipatthanas. So which four? It lists them. It lists body, feelings, mind, and dhammas, mental events. But at this part of the text, it's not yet going into the objects of attention. It's not going into the Satthipatthanas. It goes into how we engage with them. And this is what I want to spend the rest of our time on. So you've got this line that we dwell contemplating the nature of the body in the body, ardent or diligent, fully aware, mindful, and removing avarice and sorrow regarding to the world. So that's the bit that I wanted to touch on today, because that kind of sets us up for what we're doing in relation to these fields of experience for the rest of the retreat. So let me see if I can get somebody else to get a word in edgeways. First of these, I'd just like to go through the headings actually: the ardent, fully aware, mindful, and removing avarice and sorrow regarding the world. And let's see what we can get out of that. But maybe before I do, just from that little race through the context so far, any points that you'd want to make or any questions? This is about Batanas, is this word that Analio translates as diligent, but a more usual translation of it is ardent. And ardent is actually quite a good translation. The Pali word that's being translated is atapi, A-T-A-P-I. And atapi comes from a root that means hot or heat. And ardent comes from a root that means to burn. So the connotation of ardent and the connotation of atapi are quite similar, I think. So what's this saying? Excuse me. What does it mean that do you think that our engagement with the Satthipatthanas, first thing that gets mentioned is that it's ardent? Our sort of understanding of what that would mean. What's the engagement with the Satthipatthanas that suggests?
It's passionate, and it's not a kind of cold, coolly aloof awareness that there's emotional engagement with the process.
Mm-hmm. And although Badger was warning us off dialogues, John, why would that be significant, do you think?
It's more wholehearted. You've really kind of thrown yourself into it, rather than it's dispassionate. And because some of the things said later on kind of suggest it might be a bit dispassionate, and you don't care for so much. You're free from whatever it is, desires, etc. That might suggest.
I hope we'll get a chance to clarify during the text, but maybe just to hear from somebody else. So John's describing this sort of passionate, strong emotional response. Why is that significant in relationship to practice? And in a way, I'm just asking you to state the obvious, but I think not bad sometimes to state the obvious.
Ali. So for me, it's about Ardhan is about a longing, and the significance of that is because it's devotional. There's devotion to the practice. There's devotion of getting your whole being behind the practice. So there, for me, there's lots of drama in it. So it's there's like a momentum as well in the movement towards orientating your being towards that awareness.
Yeah, no, I think that gets it. I think that gets it really well, Ali. So you've got this idea of momentum and this whole idea of our whole being moving towards. And I think actually it takes time to have our whole being moving towards. But what you're trying to do is, if you've seen some of these traditional images like the ox herding pictures, and you get this little kid trying to move a buffalo, and if you've ever seen buffalo are big, and if they don't want to move, they're not going to move. And in a sense, one of the models of practice is like that. You've got this strong habitual energy of how our mind works. Our mind is not habitually aware for the large part. And what we're trying to do here is to set up a momentum where the energy moving towards awareness is gradually becoming as strong as or stronger than the energy that's moving habitually towards confusion or towards craving or towards aversion. And to get that thing that Ali's describing of the whole being moving towards, it takes an energetic engagement with practice. That the energy moving in the direction of awareness has to be strong enough to start to counter the habitual energy that moves us into confusion. So I think the first thing that's being said about practice is that it needs that kind of energy if we're going to shift the momentum, the kind of tendency of our kind of stream of awareness or stream of being. So that's the first point that gets made. The next one I think is really significant, but some fully aware and mindful, what's Analia's translation of it, clearly knowing and mindful. The Pali for that is Sampajanyo Satima, and there are two different words in there. There's Sati, which means mindful, which we've touched on already. And there's a second word, Sampajana or Sampajanyo. And Sampajanyo usually gets translated as fully aware as one translation, clearly knowing as another translation. But the underlying idea is that with Sati, you're connecting to your experience. So you've got this thing all the way through the Satthipathana Sutta of you're aware of the body in the body, aware of feelings in feelings. So you've got that as a very strong emphasis in the Satthipathana Sutta. But all the way through it, every time you've got Sati, it's part of a compound with this second term, Sampajanya. And Sati, Sampajanya are very often found as a compound word. And Sampajanya's got a different connotation. Sampajanya's got this connotation of the direction that we're trying to move in. So sometimes it gets a sense of just your awareness sustained, a continuity of awareness. But all the way through the Satthipathana Sutta, you've got two alternatives being set up. You've got worldly feelings and unworldly feelings. You've got a surpassable state of mind or an unsurpassable state of mind. You've got hindrances, you've got awakening factors. And the kind of the implication of the structure, the implication of Sampajanyo is that you're not just aware of what our experience is right now, but you're aware of where it's trying to head, if I can just provisionally use that language, or where you intend it to move to. So it's got this sense of momentum and direction, as well as a sense of connection. But they're equally important. If you've got the direction without the connection, you get a disconnect between your ideals and your experience. You can set up a tension. If you're in your experience, but without very much idea of where you're trying to go with it, it doesn't become a process necessarily that supports growth. Sangha says somewhere that growth in spiritual growth is fundamentally growth in consciousness. And growth in consciousness needs to be consciously directed. So what this Sampajanya is getting at is that conscious direction of growth. Now, I want to come back to that in a minute or two. The third one, the removing avarice and sorrow regarding the world. What's that getting at, do you think? And again, if you read different commentaries on the text, every commentary gives you a slightly different take on that. So your own intuitive sense is going to have a bit of a validity. There's not a single right response to this. So with Satthipathana, we're removing avarice and sorrow regarding the world. What would your sense be of what a relationship to practice would look like, or a relationship to those fields of experience would look like? Does that make sense as a question? Is that clear enough?
Adra. I'm kind of imagining it's something in the territory of becoming less identified with those particular responses to the world. Mm-hmm. So, well, disidentification would be.
And again, just to guard against Barry's concern that the language starts to sound a bit dispassionate. So what difference does disidentification make? What would that feel like? What would that be like in experience?
I think it would be recognizing that those more difficult experiences are held in the larger context of a broader range of experiences. So they're just part of your experience, rather than being that one gets too kind of sucked into that one particular aspect of it.
Yeah. No, good. Any other takes on this? Any other readings of what it would mean to removing avarice and sorrow regarding the world?
Ali, did you want to say something? You had your hand up.
Yeah, only if no one else does. Yeah, what came up for me was just the push and pull, not being pushed and pulled around so much by the experience. So through the practice, particularly avarice being very outward and grabby in the world, and sorrow being very aversion based. So that's
no, I think that's right. Again, the sort of the grasping and the sorrow being kind of aversion based. So what's being described here, if you put all that together, you've got the ardent. So you've got this energy starting to engage with practice. You've got the sati. So it's a real connection to curiosity about receptivity to our experience as it is in the minute. But it's not just a passive thing. There's also got a sense of the quality that we're trying to move towards. So we're trying to move from confusion to clarity. We're trying to move from disconnect to connected. We're trying to move from aversive to kind, to a kind of connection to experience. And with this, so with the Sampajanya, and then you're looking at the habits of the mind. You're looking at how we tend to cling, how we tend to push away, And the kind of request is that we just put those habits on pause a little bit and just start to have this kind of more open, more alive, more curious response to our experience that's qualitatively a little different from our habitual one. So that energetic, aware, directed, responsive quality of mind, we start to take into our body, the breath, how we feel, what our minds are doing, and then the people in the world around us. So that's the basic instruction that's being set up. Now, I hope we've got time to do this still, but one thing that I did want to touch on is I want to come back to Sampajanya. And this is the most metaphysical that this whole week is going to get. Right? There's something a little mysterious in Sangharakshita's treatment of Sampajanya. Just give me a moment till I try and find a couple of quotes. But the Sampajanya traditionally has a sort of range of readings. It can go, so continuity of purpose as one of the translations that you get, that this sense of clearly knowing. So traditionally it can mean just remembering what we're intending to do over a period of time. That's the sort of simplest reading of it. A deeper reading of it is that it's a sustained attention to the deeper nature of things, or a sustained attention to the deeper nature of our own minds. So something like a kind of sustained awareness of impermanence as a characteristic of our experience would come under Sampajanya. So those are traditional readings. But Bhante, I think, goes a step further than that, or like sort of gives it a bit of an implication that I've not really come across before, and one that I think is very intriguing. So he reads it as a kind of direction that our lives is trying to take. So let me give you the metaphysics first. So just trying to kind of root this in kind of Buddhist psychology, or even sort of Buddhist ontology. One of the metaphors in Buddhism that you find again and again is the metaphor of growth. So you have the Buddha immediately after enlightenment, and the Buddha's deliberating whether or not to teach. And you get this famous image where he sees humanity as a bed of lotuses, and some of the lotuses are, kind of covered by mud. Some are kind of half immersed in the water, but some of the lotuses are clear of the water. In the famous phrase, they have but little dust. And on the basis of that, the Buddha decides to teach, on the basis of the lotuses with but little dust. And this is a recurring metaphor in Buddhism. I mean, in a way, it's a metaphor, I imagine, in any tradition, but it's a very central metaphor in Buddhism. But from the White Lotus Sutra, again, the parable of the rain cloud. And the image in the parable of the rain cloud is that the Dharma is like rain, and a single rain falls, and it nourishes the plants. But each of the plants grows according to its own nature. So some of the plants are flowers, some of the plants are herbs, some of the plants are trees. So you get this sort of slightly mysterious metaphor that a single rain falls, a single phenomenon of growth happens, but the growth isn't a uniformed thing. Every plant has its own shape and its own nature. And one of the points that gets made in the Buddhist tradition is Buddhist practice works because it's rooted in the nature of things. That's what makes practice effective. So the metaphysics is that from the Buddhist point of view, reality is a process of becoming, that you're just looking at this process of becoming, that some of our behaviors recognize and allow that process of becoming. Well, sorry, another step is that process of becoming is not an abstract thing. It's our own nature. If you look at our own experience, if we look at our experience through this week, everything that we attend to is alive and unfolding. The sensations of our body, what's emerging in our minds, everything is alive, everything's an emergence into experience. And what Buddhist practice is trying to say, I think, is certain behaviors support and allow that growing, that thriving to take place. And certain behaviors misunderstand its nature and try to block it, or try to separate it, or try to fix it. And whenever we act in a way, clinging is trying to fix a process of unfolding. Aversion is trying to separate ourselves from a process of that unfolding. Whenever we respond in a way that misunderstands or tries to fix that process of becoming, it's painful. Whenever we respond in a way that recognizes, understands, and cooperates with the fundamental nature of reality, we align ourselves with the nature of things. We align ourselves with the nature of our own minds, and out of that comes the whole process of liberation. A quote from Subhuti, where he says that there are currents in reality that lead in the direction of liberation. And our job as practitioners is to cooperate with those currents. So what you're trying to do in practice is you're tuning in to this sort of natural process of becoming that shows itself, that it embodies itself in every dimension of our experience. And we're starting to actively understand its nature and cooperate with it. And in a sense, if it's not too dogmatic or not too grand, that's what Buddhist practice is. It's how we cooperate with that unfolding dynamic nature of our own being. And the Satthipathana Sutta goes into some detail about that. But all of that is by way of preamble. What Bhante says about it, he talks about life stories. And he says if you listen to people's life story, it's almost, you hear people talk about how they came to spiritual practice. And he says it's almost like there's something that's been driving them to spiritual practice, even if they've not been conscious of it. You can see the same patterns, the same motifs occur and recur throughout people's lives. And quite often this impulse towards growth isn't something abstract. It takes shape in our specific psyches. It takes shape in our specific lives. I was listening to a couple of people in my community give their life stories. And one person's life story, you could hear again and again this interest in community and this interest in creating community, and going from their political involvement to the communes that they had lived in to their involvement in Sangha. And it's like at every step of it was a kind of fuller and fuller expression of a deep driver in their behaviour. And what I think the parable of the rain clouds getting at, what I think Sangharakshita is getting at, is that this process of sampajanya is us becoming in a more sustained way aware of that impulse to growth, aware of the shape that it takes in our own lives, and increasingly starting to cooperate with that natural unfolding of the process of becoming in our lives. So as I say, that's the most metaphysical we're going to get for this whole week, but I find it such an intriguing idea. And what I'd like to do in the time that we've got left is just go into groups. So let's go for groups of 3, that's probably more practical. And what I'd like to ask us to do is to just take 5 minutes reflection time. And you're not going to have time to tell your whole life, right? Or it would be beautiful if we had. But take a single incident, just reflect for a minute, see what comes to mind. Take a single incident in your life that's been spiritually significant for you, and just tell the other 2 people in the group about it. So describe it, evoke it, have that quality of sati and connection about it, but just sort of what happened and what was significant about that for you, and how would you relate it? Why is it significant from the point of view of your own developing spiritual practice? So that's what I'm going to suggest that we do for the time that we've got left. Before we do, any comments about that? Any questions about it? Either about the metaphysics or about what you're going to be doing for the next 40 minutes.
I'm sorry, I haven't got the, what is it, a hand up, I only have claps. And
No worries. Yeah, that's fine.
I wouldn't misconstrue the claps, don't worry.
yeah, I thought it was really interesting what you said about that. Sometimes the Buddhist teachings are seen sometimes as so negative about, you know, not, because it's just like what you've been talking about, it just fills me with a lot of sort of positivity, and I can very much, for me, the metaphor also of like a stream works, that I'm sort of like aligning myself to this strong stream. And I think it's not a coincidence that we talk about stream entry or something, that there's something about sometimes when I feel like I am sort of aligned to something, it feels like there's a strong current going in sort of the same direction. And sometimes it's, I also like the sort of symbol of the salmon, you know, the salmon goes actually also against the stream, but also to grow, isn't it? It goes up, and it's, and I think Sangharakshita has talked also about going upstream, isn't it? So it's not always, it's not always easy, is it? Mm-hmm. It's not always easy, but that, you know, what that sort of ardent is, it's not about easy, it's about, it's this sort of passionate energy that goes, you know, that just knows it needs to go that way to grow. And
a lot of the effort, I think, is just the effort of working against the habits. And then, as you say, you hit the stream, you turn into a current. I mean, like, for me, it's a terribly encouraging thing about practice, that your practice isn't us trying to will change. Our practice is tuning in to the universe disclosing itself in our experience. It's a momentum that we don't need to create. We just need to cooperate with it.
Yeah, but in my experience, there's something about coming to that point to let go into that stream. There's something needs to, some condition need to come to happen to trust that. There's some fear around letting go of that holding on, of that fixing of that self.
Great point. And let's take maybe one more comment before we go into groups.
Trisha.
I'm not sure whether this is fully formulated, and maybe for a little bit later once it's all settled in my mind. But I was interested in your description of the rain cloud and how it rains on us as individuals. So we have a momentum towards spiritual growth, but that spiritual growth would be different for everyone. Is that what that's pointing to? That, and do you think we have a kind of individual nature in terms of how we would grow as how we would grow? As I say, it's not really formulated yet, but there was something.
Honestly, I think it's a great question, and I think on the one hand there are things in common, right? So I think spiritual growth is always a growth in awareness. I think spiritual growth is always a kind of move towards more open-heartedness. But if you have a look around your Zoom screen, right, and if you look at the shape that takes in our particular character and in our particular circumstances. So I think you get this paradox almost that there's, what is it, just as the great ocean has one taste. I think there's a taste to practice, but mysteriously you don't end up with everybody converging. You know, like if anything, as I say, just have a look at the Zoom screen, and what was it? You get the wisdom of sameness, and also the sort of wisdom of distinctness. I can't remember the traditional names, and both of those are true. There's a flavour that practice shares, and it's not that you all become shades of beige. It's something much more particular than that. Let's have a break. Let's sort of just stop for 5 minutes, and then let's have the rest of the time in our little groups. We've got about 35 minutes left. So 5 minutes just to reflect, and a bit of, well, 5 minutes for a breather, 5 minutes to reflect, perhaps during the breather, about something that was significant for you. And don't worry about getting it right. In a way, anything that's got a bit of resonance that comes to mind. And then just a bit of time describing that to the others in the group and what was significant about it for you. And then at least let's get together for 5 minutes or so, just to tune in a little bit at the end. All right, is people clear enough of what they're going to be doing for the next 35 minutes? Okay, at least Vimala, Chitta and Trisha are. Great.